podcast discussion about Michael Levin, professor at Tufts University for bioengineering. A very interesting conversation with Sean Carroll. I want to talk about this. One particular insight that I got from the podcast is the idea of words being kind of sometimes using old concepts for things that we don't really know. For example, what is a robot? What is a human? What if we mix a robot with a human? Levin works on very interesting concepts where he is sort of crossing the boundaries between artificial intelligence, natural intelligence, human brain, and organisms. So all these concepts start kind of melting together in Levin's work, and therefore the words like robot, human, machine, all these things start becoming ambiguous. It's not very clear anymore. And I think that's a very interesting concept also in the investment world. What is an investment? A lot of people talk about being investors, but they really aren't investors. They're gamblers. And a lot of gamblers kind of, they think that they're gambling when in reality they're losing money. So let's get back to the investment world. I think in particular, recently we've had these issues with GameStop. We had issues with Bitcoin and people just thinking that they're sort of investors when in reality they're either gamblers or even worse. Nassim Taleb today on Twitter said something interesting. He said, if you're a Bitcoiner, you're not an investor. It's a religion, and that's fine. But just let's be clear about what we're talking about. So I want to talk about all these concepts, but in particular about Levin's work. I think I haven't done podcast reviews on my podcast yet, and this is the first one, and I'm going to continue doing that. I think these reviews are important when I do book reviews, podcast reviews, because they have a certain I think it's important to remember this. So even if for now maybe it might not be that illuminating, I think very often later on when concepts start getting more shape, or when things get together to a more concrete thing, then you can go back and kind of think about what you were thinking back then versus what is the reality at that point in time. So I think that therefore that's one of the values of reviews. Of course, another value of the review is just for me, for myself, to actually clarify the thought to myself. This is not even on podcast. It's February 23rd, 2021. This is Crimdelco. For the day, the fund is down 3.3%. The market is up 20 basis points. For the year, we are up about 2%. The market is up 3.5%. We're underperforming by 1.5% roughly. This is the first time in 2021 that we're underperforming the market. So certainly, unfortunately, one of those times when we have to realize that our positions not always outperform, and that is part of the game. And again, the purpose of the Not Even Wrong podcast is to give people a sense for what it feels like to run a hedge fund. And this is certainly one of those times when you really have to understand what the business of a hedge fund manager is about. The business of a hedge fund manager is not about bragging about returns every day and about the outperformance and things like that, because there are times when things go the other way. And this is one of those times. I'm going to discuss a little bit why this is happening and then get back to the discussion of Levin and the words and the meanings of words in particular that I think I kind of got as a thought nugget out of the podcast. So what's going on? We spoke about this yesterday, the rotation. I don't want to stick with that because I don't think this is a rotation from tech into value stocks or anything like that. This to us feels a lot more like the froth of the last couple of weeks, in particular around GameStop and Robinhood, and to some extent also about Bitcoin. That froth is being washed out of the market. There has been a lot of leverage in the market anyway because of low interest rates, and then you add players like Robinhood, which in my view are just online brokers with a lot of leverage. Robinhood is not doing anything other than giving people a lot more bang for the buck through giving them cheap leverage. And that's fine on the way up. That gets very nasty on the way down, and this is what's happening. If you look at the stocks today that underperformed, including Tesla, the biotech stocks in our portfolio, then there's a lot of stocks like Beyond Meat and Peloton and Snowflake and Cloudflare and whatnot, all these companies that went public recently, or even those SPACs like QuantumScape, they're all underperforming massively. And sort of and those are kind of the stocks, I call them the Robin Hood stocks, the stocks that all these so-called millennials, these new types of investors, and whatever else names you want to choose for that type of investor, all of this stuff is being, as I say, washed out of the market. Now, what does this mean? Wash out of the market. If we are right, then what it actually means mechanically is simply that people have too much leverage. That, let's say, people have bought Tesla shares or the ARK Invest Genomics ETF with 2 or 3 times leverage. That's what it actually means. And when the washout happens, that is when for some reason these securities go down in price, and then you have to sell them to cover your margin. That is actually what it means. And the problem with these types of things, of course, is you never know what triggers the kind of washout, and more importantly, you don't know when it ends. Typically, it ends, unfortunately, way below fundamental value. So that means that if you're long something at 2, 3, 5 times margin, so that means that you have $100 in your account, but you own $500 worth of Tesla. Well, guess what? You can do the math here. If Tesla goes from 500 to 400, you've already lost all your equity. So that's certainly a very difficult situation to be in. And probably it will not stop there. It will go even further down until this washout is over. So it's hard to say. Our guess is that we have another 20% downside, and then things will stabilize from here. So this would be our worst case scenario, given the scenarios that we're looking at right now. So this is something we're prepared for. Hopefully it doesn't happen, but this is kind of how we think always. We think, okay, what is the worst case scenario? How should we think, and also mentally prepare ourselves to not panic if it happens. If these things happen in the next couple of weeks, then the good news is that we're predicted them, so that means we know what's going on. And it's very important in the market to know what's going on. Even if you lose money, it's good to know why you're losing money, so you can position yourself either to then buy at the right time, or at least not panic and not sell. So this is, in a nutshell, I think what's going on in the market. I think Bitcoin is part of the problem also. It's kind of convoluted. Of course, Bitcoin as it's on its own, the blockchain technology and the idea of using blockchain technology as a distributed, decentralized way to deal with identity and trust on the internet. That is a very interesting concept, and we're working on this concept, and potentially also will make some investments. However, unfortunately, it has mingled with Bitcoin and the speculation and the constant obsession of people looking at the price of Bitcoin and things like that. And that is just terrible. That's not a good thing. Not good for the market, not good for the people that are involved. It's just a bad situation all overall. On top of that, you add leverage to this equation, and things can go pretty wrong. And unfortunately, I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of Bitcoin speculators are also speculating in stocks like Tesla. So we are unfortunately kind of, how should I say, we are intermingled with these people through our investment with Tesla. That's just the reality in the markets. You buy a house and somebody on your block does some bad things, then you are also exposed to that because you're on that same block. That's kind of the concept here, that with investing, you're never alone. You're part of a crowd, and you can hope that this washout cleans the situation a little bit. I said this today in our morning meeting. If I have to take a 20-30% drawdown so I can get rid of Robinhood, I don't have to read about this anymore, and I can just keep going on with the financial markets as they are, with the leverage that they are, but some sort of a reasonable amount of leverage, then I'd be pretty happy. If I could also get rid of the algo traders, if I could get rid of a lot of things, life in the markets would be easier. But unfortunately, these people are in the market. There's a lot of speculators. There's a lot of so-called algorithmic traders, or people that are using models that work until they don't work and therefore are not really models but just speculative reasons to speculate in short. Uh, there's a lot of these types of people in the market. They will always be in the market, and we cannot wish them away because they will always come back. We have to it's much more practical to learn to live with them. Now let's get back to Michael Levin. This is really more important, I think, and more interesting. So Michael Levin is a professor at Tufts for bioengineering. Here are the couple of things from this conversation. Number one, he thinks of biology as a computational problem with the substrate of biology versus computer science being a computational problem with the substrate of digital hardware. So he's saying biology and computer science, in fact, are the same thing. And he's looking at biology as a computational problem. So for him, the question is, okay, how does this computation work? And he has this nice analogy where we have the genome being the software, and then there's something like a compiler that he calls sort of an intercellular pan-organismic electronic exchange of information. So he calls these, there's gap junctions between cells that literally have voltage capabilities and can also transmit electric signals. So they kind of act like transistors in a sense that you can have information and memory and all those sort of things in an organism, and that information, that memory gets transmitted through electric signals. So very similar to an integrated circuit in the general computer science world. So what he's saying is that these pathways, these intercellular pathways, this organisms that are multicellular and that the cells talk to each other and have certain information and memory, and that part of the organism is instrumental in shaping how the proteins which are encoded in the genome actually work. What that means in the end is what he calls plasticity of living organisms. So for example, we have a certain memory in our organism, we humans, that certain cells, once they keep developing, should turn into liver cells. If we damage some of that DNA, or if something goes wrong, the memory and the compiler, or this organization, or this information above the single cell, it takes care of the fault and still makes sure that the cell starts morphing into a liver cell, for example. So this plasticity, he talks about this also on his website. He does a lot of research on the plasticity of the brain. This plasticity is key. So what he's saying is that we have an organism where there are certain different levels of I, or different levels of individual will. There's the cell, then there is the nearest neighbor of the cell, the tissue, the organ, the organism. All these things have different levels of will, or if you want, different levels of agency. And that is a very interesting insight, because that, for example, opens the question. So if we understand the genome, and if we use CRISPR to actually manipulate the genome, are we really, what are our chances of success? Because we don't quite understand how this genome interacts with this compiler, or this intercellular electric signaling, or this organization around the cell. How does that interact? And it's a little bit like if you write software, you have a compiler that translates software, so your Python code, into machine language. So what Levin is saying is there's a similar thing where the software is the genome, and there's a compiler that transmits what the genome codes, the proteins, into some sort of working together that fulfills the goal of the organism. And I think similar with the software, if you can have faulty software that still gets compiled properly, you can have efficient or inefficient software that gets compiled properly, but you can also have software that finally the compiler says, no, there's an error. So you could have these types of events also in life sciences, where the genome you can have several types of genomes, several types of genetic information that lead to the same outcomes. You could have certain genetic information that turn out to have faulty um, that have faulty error messages. So that actually end up, for example, really killing the organism. So you could have these things, but in many times, and what it means, the plasticity of living organisms is that you could have different types of genomes, different types of genetics encodings, different types of proteins, and then still get the same outcome because of that compiler or that electric signaling, intercellular electric signaling between the different cells and the organs in a body. So what Levin now further talks about is sort of the question, okay, what are actually words? So if we think about a sort of an artificial uh, situation now, a situation, a human being or a robot or something along those lines where we mix the robot and the human being, what exactly is a human if we have a 50% human brain that also is controlled by maybe 50% artificial intelligence? Or if we have a vacuum cleaner that uses uh, human brain type capabilities to adapt to the environment? What if we have a robot that is uh, constructed similar to humans, where the sub components of the robot have their own sort of internal um, will or internal purpose, and they do work together, but they also are plastic in a way that they can adapt to the environment if necessary. So, what are these things? And I think that's an interesting question per se, detached now from the conversation of Levin. What exactly is what exactly are words? And very often, when we are at the cusp of new developments, we lack words. And this is actually a good indicator sometimes for that we are at the cusp of new things. When there is such a thing as new words or new developments that that we don't really know what they mean. For example, we don't really know what genomics revolution means because it's a new thing. We don't know what genomics actually even means. I mean, there's a definition on Wikipedia, but what does it mean to be able to read the genome, to manipulate the genome? What exactly does that mean? Well, there's a functional meaning, which is simply that the genome encodes for proteins. So if we understand how the genome encodes for proteins, then we can also understand how the protein encoding works. And since AlphaFold has even solved the protein folding problem, we have this huge opportunity now to go from the code, the genetic code, all the way to the protein. And that is something we understand. So, but we still lack words, and we often use words from the old, from sort of the uh, from the pre-revolution, or from the time before the new technology was developed and the new culture evolves around the technology. We use words from them. So we say, for example, genomic revolution, when in fact maybe we should call it something more like protein determinism or something like that. I'm just making this up now. But my point here is that we often lack words, and that is also very prevalent in the investment world. We use these old definitions. For example, Tesla is a car company. Well, it's obviously not a car company. Tesla is an energy company. It's obviously not an energy company. We don't really know what Tesla is right now. And part of the problem of not being able to classify a company, for example, is also the proof that this company is at the cusp of implementing fundamentally new concepts and engineering practices with large impact, which is, of course, what our mission is and what we're trying to achieve with Orange Capital Partners. So to summarize, Michael Levin, professor at Tufts for bioengineering, very interesting podcast with Sean Carroll, highly recommended. He talks about the concept of having several layers of sort of will or free will within an organism, starting from the cell all the way up to the human, for example, or the monkey or the worm. Doesn't matter what kind of organism we're talking about, but all these things are they are put together with various subcomponents, and they all have their different sort of their different will, and that is what life science or what life and biology is so powerful for. The ability, the plasticity, the ability to adapt, because all these individual components, they're glued together through these gap junctions that perform electric information, that transmit electric information, that have memory and things like that. But there's also a certain will from the individual cell all the way up to the organ and then the organism. Even humans can have very individual thoughts and detach themselves from the society that they live in. So we have this bi-directional world of collectivism and individualism, not just on the human level, but all the way down to the cell level. And the fundamental question, of course, here is, if we are able to manipulate the genome, to edit the genome, how are we interacting with that compiler, that electric signaling of the organism beyond the cell? How does that interact? And are we on the right path here, or should we understand more about the interaction, the sort of beyond the cell and beyond the tissue and beyond the organ, that this type of, or what he calls the compiler, is as important as the software? Those are the open questions that we want to ask Michael Levin, we want to ask our portfolio companies in the Crispr index, because that to us seems a very relevant question for the future of digitized biology, which is part of the theme that we are investing in with our Crispr index.